Travelers. I'm your host, the C. that knows a lot, Dr. Waluigi. As a kid, and even as an adult, one genre that I find was the most creative and influential throughout the 80s was the fantasy genre. It's the genre that I've always found the most creative visually and audibly with how much variety this genre has given us, with epic films like The Dark Crystal and the Lord of the Rings series, to the more goofy and silly movies of the 80s barbarian style of films like that of Conan the Barbarian and The Beastmaster. But this is also a genre that has some of the most well-known love stories as well, with stories like the classic fairy tales and the one I will be talking about today. A story that was beautifully adapted by Rankin Bass and several of the people who would go on to work with Studio Ghibli about a unicorn that went looking for others like her. This is my review of the 1982 animated classic, The Last Unicorn. The movie is based off of the book of the same name by author Peter S. Beagle, who also wrote the screenplay for this movie. There have been many companies that have wanted to adapt this story into an animated film, from the owners of the Peanuts specials to then 20th Century Fox. Eventually, the film was given to the Rankin Bass production company, who hired the Japanese animation team Topcraft to animate the movie. They had previously worked on several other animated films for Rankin Bass, including the animated adaptations of The Hobbit, The Return of the King, and The Flight of Dragons. At first, Mr. Beagle wasn't keen on having Rankin Bass work on the adaptation, as he always knew the film should be animated and more than likely feared it would have been turned into one of the many stop-motion animated pictures Rankin Bass was known for. But fortunately, the film was handled by the amazing team at Topcraft that would go on to work for one of the many masters of Japanese animation, Hayao Miyazaki. The film was a moderate success at the box office, making roughly $6.5 million against its $35 million budget, and has since then been considered a cult hit and has many fans all over the world, including myself, for its amazing animation, lovable cast and characters, and its beautiful soundtrack. To the point that back in 2015, there was a big tour of the movie after Mr. Beagle reacquired the rights to this movie and brought it on tour throughout Canada and the US. Which I sadly couldn't go to because life kicked my ass that year. My first experience with the movie was when I was about 12 years old, when I first saw this movie at my local library and picked it up just on how strange the DVD cover was alone. Since then, I've been in love with this movie and everything fantasy because of it. I honestly think that without this movie, I wouldn't have checked out so many other amazing fantasy movies from the 80s like Willow, Legend, and even the original My Little Pony movie. It's one movie I don't ever regret watching, and I rewatch it as often as I can. But enough about me gushing over this movie, let's get into the meat and potatoes of why this movie is amazing. The movie follows a unicorn, played by Mia Farrow, who hears from two hunters that she may be the last unicorn in the world, and decides to leave her home to find the other unicorns after she hears from a butterfly that a creature known as the Red Bull has chased them to the ends of the earth. On her way, she meets many strange and interesting characters, some of which join her on her journey to find the Red Bull, who was controlled by the evil King Hangard, voiced by Christopher Lee. Can she free her fellow unicorns from the clutches of the master of the Red Bull, or will she be captured and join her fellow unicorns as the king's newest prisoner? We once again have an amazing voice cast in this movie, with many of these actors who were and would go on to be big names in the industry. Mia Farrow voices the unicorn, who would later in the film be turned into a human named Amalthea, and gives the character a sense of mystery and eventually sorrow when she learns to regret from being in human form. Her journey is one that I've seen done only a few times before, but not done in a fantasy setting, and it's what makes the movie such an interesting watch. The characters that she meets along the way also have their own interesting stories and reasons for wanting to follow her. We have Schmendrick the Magician, voiced by the late Alan Arkin, who follows the unicorn to try and awaken his true power as a sorcerer and maybe find out where he belongs in the world. Molly Grew, voiced by Tammy Grimes, lived with a group of outlaws until she came across the unicorn and Schmendrick and wanted to come along with them, mostly because she had no reason to go back to the outlaws, but also wanted to stay with them as she never got to see a unicorn until she was an old woman and wants to make sure no one will never get the chance to see a unicorn ever again. But it's not just our heroes who are interesting. The villains are just as great, from the small encounter of Mommy Fortuna, voiced by the late Angela Lansbury, who's a 2-bit witch that uses illusions to entertain crowds of people desperate to see the magical creatures of this world, while also having a real harpy in her circus. Then there's the main villain of the movie and master of the Red Bull, King Haggard, voiced by the late Christopher Lee, who's a man that lives in a decrepit and worn-down old castle with his only adopted son, Prince Lear, voiced by Jeff Bridges. The king is a character that finds very few things in his life that make him happy, and keeps the unicorns he's captured because they remind him of a time when he was young and full of life. But now he keeps the unicorns to himself so that only he can admire their beauty. He's a character that I feel like a lot of people can relate to because I see him as someone who is obsessed with the past and tries to collect certain things from their childhood in order to relive their happiest moments, but not realizing that by doing so he is hurting himself and, in this case, the creatures that he holds captive. The cast does an amazing job creating these fantasy characters and giving them a life of their own that I think many people can relate to and create a connection with. Oh, where to begin with this section? This movie has so many amazing things in it, from the animation, the writing, and especially the music. I'll just say that the main reason why all three of these things work for this movie is because the creators made the story feel like both a traditional fairy tale and a Greek myth. I'd say that the film's animation and music remind me a lot of an old storybook or tapestry that would have been made around the time period where these stories would have been retold by authors like the Brothers Grimm. But the way the movie is written is something out of a Greek tragedy, with the unicorn going on an adventure to save her people only to come back home a changed person. Which is what the book's author, Peter S. Beagle, really nailed, as he was told a lot of these stories from his mother as a young kid and basically made the book in honor of her memory. It's something that this era of films, I feel, did really well, as the 80s was the era of imagination and wonder, and is something that I miss from a lot of modern fantasy movies. I sadly feel like more modern films haven't really captured what the 80s was able to do at the time, which is to make a story that treated the audience like adults by giving us well-structured stories on top of some amazing action scenes, especially with the fights of the unicorn and the Red Bull, which, while there may not be as many, are gorgeous to look at, with the design of the Red Bull looking like it came from the fires of hell, and the unicorn being the shining beacon of heavenly hope that eventually sends the Red Bull into the sea prison that the other unicorns were placed in. But the one thing that really stands out about this movie is its music. The score was handled by Jimmy Webb, who really does a great job at making these scenes feel as magical as the unicorn herself, but the songs were handled by the band America, who do an incredible job at making this movie feel like an epic fantasy journey. This soundtrack is the main reason people remember this movie, with just the main theme alone getting several covers by many famous singers, including Kenny Loggins and Dan Avidan of Ninja Sex Party fame. I think if it weren't for the amazing soundtrack and writing, this movie would have been left in obscurity and wouldn't be as well loved as it is today. I honestly have no negatives to talk about with this movie. I'm aware that people often say that there's no such thing as a perfect movie, and I do agree with that statement somewhat. I don't think that there are no movies that can be 10 out of 10s or are considered perfect, because I feel like when someone gives a movie a 10 out of 10, it just means that they enjoyed it so much that it becomes one of their personal favorites. Even you watching this video at home, I'm willing to bet, have many movies that you would consider a 10 out of 10, and that's perfectly fine. We all have movies like that, whether they be classics like The Wizard of Oz to The Godfather, or even something that's considered a cult classic like The Thing or Masters of the Universe. We all have different things that make us who we are, and that's the beauty of being your own person, because you don't have to agree with me and might think that this movie is just okay. Hell, I know many people out there who don't like movies from the 80s because they dislike the effect and animation in this case. And while I do disagree with those people, I do think it's important to learn why and see things from a different perspective. Because who knows, maybe there are movies you might not think were good when you saw the trailer, but maybe someone else's opinion will change your mind and vice versa. Though if I do have to complain about one thing about this movie's merchandising issue, it's this. Why was the physical copy of the soundtrack only released in Germany? Seriously, the person that made that decision should have been fired for making it impossible to find the songs for those of us who want to collect the physical soundtrack. If none of you could already tell, I love the hell out of this movie. From the amazing characters to the magical animation and the beautiful music, all of it was perfectly put together for an amazing fantasy experience that I will never forget for as long as I live, and is one that I hope many others will experience down the line as well. I give The Last Unicorn a 10 out of 10. I also highly recommend checking out the book and the graphic novel, as those are just as good as the movie. Now, if only somebody would release the soundtrack to the West, then the universe would be in balance. Thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Waluigi. And remember, don't judge a book by its cover, cause you'll never know what's inside. Good night.